Right, okay. How are we doing? You all right? This is Mr. Derbyshire here, and having just finished your space topic, we're going to be starting a new topic today, and I'm leading you through the first introduction lesson of this topic. So the topic itself is called Unicellular Organisms, and as you can see, today's title is really defining that keyword. We're going to be looking at the differences between unicellular and multicellular living things. So if you want to get yourself a drink, get yourself a pen, something to write on, we're going to go through, make a few notes as I lead you through the kind of the introductory lesson to this first lesson for this new topic. Okay, so here we go. So as you can see on the board, we've got 5 living things, 5 organisms in front of you. I don't think many of them will be familiar. Some of these might be completely new. I don't want you to name them, but what I'd like to do is to look at the 5 pictures and to have a bit of a guess as to which ones do you think are organisms made of one cell, and which of those are organisms made of more than one cell. Which of these are unicellular, made of one cell? Which of these are multicellular? If you want to put the numbers 1 to 5 down your margin, you can have a bit of a guess, see if you think, so you can tell from the pictures. And then for starter B, what I'd like to do is to think about how do we know that these 5 things are living? How do we decide when we're looking at something? How can we tell, is it a living thing or not? You're going to need to think back to what you did at the start of year 7, perhaps stuff that you did in primary school as well to help you to decide. I'm going to give you a few moments to do that. So if you want to pause the video, this is the time to do that, and then we'll go through the answers to those 2 starters in a moment. Okay, welcome back. So while you were doing that starter, the heavens have suddenly opened, and we've got all sorts of thunder and lightning going on outside, so you might hear a little bit of that in the background. But let's have a look at the answers to, firstly, starter B. So starter B was, how do we decide if something is a living thing? So if you've got something that you're not sure about, let's take something like coral, which, let's be honest, doesn't look like it's alive, looks like it's a rock. How do you decide if that's a living thing or not? And we need to use these processes that we talked about right at the beginning of year 7, the 7 life processes that all living things or all organisms do. This is a word I'd recommend jotting down if you've not already got it down in your notes. This word organism simply means living thing. And so if you remember from year 7, and maybe you did this at primary school as well, we use this mnemonic, Mrs. Gren, to remember the 7 key life processes that all living things have to be able to do all of these 7 things. So we've got movement, reproduction, sensitivity, growth, respiration, which you remember from earlier in the year isn't simply breathing, it's the chemical reaction required to produce energy within a cell. And then lastly, we've got excretion, producing waste, and nutrition, eating food. Okay, so those 7 things are how we decide whether or not something's living or not. Can they do all of those 7 processes? Okay, and then going back to starter A, we have these 5 different living things. All of these things are organisms, but we're looking at, well, can we tell if they are unicellular or multicellular? That word uni simply means one, so unibrow, someone who's just got one eyebrow. Multi means many. And so again, another little definition, if you need it, is perhaps those 2 keywords. A unicellular organism is one made of just one cell. Multicellular organism is made of more than one cell. Okay, so we have a quick look at what these 5 living things are. Some of them you might recognize. So number 1 is a simple bacterium. Number 2 is an amoeba. Number 3 is a type of filamentous algae. Number 4 is a type of polyp called a hydra, kind of closely related to coral. And then number 5 is a paramecium. And if you can see at the bottom, numbers 1, 2, and 5, so the bacterium over here, the amoeba down here, and the paramecium over here are the 3 types of unicellular organisms. They're all made of just one cell, and that the hydra over here and the algae in the middle are examples of multicellular organisms. The key thing to take from this start, though, is actually it's quite difficult by looking at it. Just by looking at the organism, it's often quite difficult to tell whether or not it's unicellular or single-celled. And so we're going to look at some other ways of doing that as the lesson goes on. Okay, so these are the 3 objectives, the 3 things really we need to be able to do by the end of today's lesson. So we're going to start off by describing some of the differences between unicellular and multicellular organisms. We'll have a quick look at viruses as well. Obviously, that's quite relevant at the moment. We're going to talk about and explain why multicellular organisms need efficient transport systems. And then lastly, we're going to use organisms to identify the members of different animal kingdoms. And there'll be a bit of revision in this from earlier in year 8 when we looked at classification and we decided which organisms go into which particular kingdom of life. Okay, so first things first, All living things have two things in common, and I'd like you to jot these down in your notes, please. We've kind of talked about this in the starter already. First thing that they have in common is they all perform, firstly, the 7 life processes, the Mrs. Gren processes that we just talked about, and also they are made of cells. Cells are the building blocks of life, and they're kind of all living things are made of these structures called cells. We've said already that organisms made of one single cell are unicellular, whilst organisms made of many cells are multicellular. Here's just a few examples of each. So this is a single bacterium, single-celled organism. Bacterium are the smallest type of cell that we find in biology, and this is the bacterium that caused bubonic plague. This is a very, very simple multicellular organism, one of the smallest forms of multicellular organism you can find, something called a nematode worm. There are about 1,000 cells within a nematode, and these are also the most numerous. These are found within just 1 square foot of soil. There will be millions and millions of these forms of very, very tiny, very small multicellular organisms. And then you've got an adult human, which again, you can see there, got 37 trillion cells within an adult human being. So you can see the contrast there from a single-celled organism all the way up to human beings. You can go bigger than that, you can go blue whale, and all the different cells that make up these multicellular, very complex organisms. Okay, and just a little quick side note on viruses. Obviously very current in terms of what's going on in the world at the moment, but we can very safely say that viruses at this particular level anyway, at key stage 3, we don't need to worry about viruses. They are not living organisms, mainly because, as you can see at the bottom there, because they don't meet those 2 criteria that we talked about on the last slide. They're not made of cells, and they can't do all of the 7 life processes on their own. They're not made of cells. They're simply just strands of protein, or strands of DNA, I should say, surrounded by a protein coat. And in terms of the 7 life processes, they can only really do one of them. But even that reproduction, they can only do with the help of their host organisms. So at this level, we're going to say they are not living. It gets a bit more complicated as you go up in terms of academia and you go to university. There are lots of people who would debate whether or not they are alive. Different types of living organisms. For now, we're going to say they're not. You can see some different types that we obviously don't need to know about: HIV, rabies, hepatitis. All these different types of viruses are caused by structures that aren't living. Okay, so we've kind of shown some very basic differences there between the 2 types of organisms, single-celled and multicellular organisms. What we're going to want to talk about now is just a little bit about how these different forms of life get the substances and the nutrients that they need to survive. When it comes to cells, and when it comes to cellular biology, size really does matter in terms of how big a cell is, has a real impact on how easy it is to be able to get the nutrients that it needs. For example, if we take these 2 cells on the slide, you can see here, the cell on the left-hand side, which is far smaller, is going to be much more able to absorb the nutrients that it needs. In both of these examples, they're going to be absorbing the nutrients that they need, so whether that's oxygen or glucose. These substances are going to be coming into the cell by the process of diffusion. Just a little bit of a recap in terms of what diffusion is. You may have forgotten while we've been on lockdown. Diffusion is that process where molecules move, or particles move, from a high concentration where there's lots of them, and you can see in the light blue solution, you can see there's lots and lots of these little dots. They move from a high concentration into an area of low concentration, i.e. into the cell. Nutrients, water, and oxygen diffuse quickly and easily into these small cells because they have a very small surface area. But with this larger cell, because they've got such a large area, it's going to take them a lot longer to get the nutrients that they need into the middle of the cell. They've got a great distance to travel, and there's a larger area for them to move into. So therefore, diffusion with a large cell is much slower, and therefore it's not the best way of them getting the nutrients that they need into the center of the cell. Therefore, because of that process, because of how slow it is for large single-celled organisms, many of these single-celled organisms adapt a different strategy. Instead of just relying simply on diffusion, larger cells like a paramecium or an amoeba would have a slightly different strategy in that they would engulf their food, a bit like a Pac-Man. They'd kind of come along and surround it and almost engulf the cell that they are to digest. And if you click on the link below, you can watch this little kind of rather disturbing video of a cell being swallowed and eaten alive and engulfed in this manner, an amoeba eating a paramecium. And again, that means that process of diffusion doesn't need to take place. They can get it straight into the middle of their cell, and they can get the nutrients that they need much more quickly. But conversely, obviously, if you're a multicellular organism, absorbing substances by diffusion isn't really an option. There are some that do it. So some amphibians will rely on diffusion to be able to get oxygen into their blood through what's called cutaneous diffusion, i.e. it just moves straight across their skin. But most multicellular organisms have to adapt by having a transport system to be able to get the nutrients and the oxygen and the substances that they need into their bodies. They need to transport those around their bodies using some form of a transport system. That might be usually a form of a system of a circulatory system, like the blood, for example, to get those nutrients around to each of the cells that need it. And you can see that an example of that in this spider here. You can see lots of different organs, lots of different organ systems working together to provide the cells in that living thing with the different nutrients that it needs. Okay, so a little task for you to have a go at now. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this. So in a moment, you're going to pause the video. And what I'd like to do is to look at these three different diagrams, these three different cells. We've got a tiny bacterial cell. We've got a larger amoeba. You can see that's eating this paramecium, this poor little paramecium here. And then you can see here, muscle cell within a human being, these large cells of a multicellular organism. And what I'd like to do in your notes or in your book, what I'd like to do is to explain why large cells packed inside muscle tissue need a good blood supply to deliver nutrients, while unicellular organisms do not. Okay, so if you'd like to pause the video now, have a go at your answer, and then we'll go through a few marking points in just a moment. Okay, so let's have a little look at the answers that we've got there. So again, we're contrasting, we're just taking what we've talked about there and applying it to a quick question. We've got these three different types of cell, two single-celled organisms, one large, one small, and then we've got cells within a multicellular organism. The kind of points that you could get for this, if this came up as a question on the mark scheme, you'd be looking for these kind of points. So that small bacteria do not need a blood supply to get nutrients, because nutrients simply diffuse into the cell. So here, because it's a nice small cell, very easy for it to get the nutrients that it needs through simple diffusion. The amoeba in the middle, slightly larger cell, therefore it's too large to rely on diffusion to be able to get its nutrients. There will be a bit of diffusion, but diffusion is going to take too long. It's a slow process. And so therefore, it engulfs the paramecium to be able to absorb the nutrients that it needs. It doesn't need a blood supply, however, because it's not that large. And then the last few points talking about this multicellular muscle tissue. The muscle cells are too big and packed together to obtain nutrients by diffusion from the environment. They also can't eat food to get nutrients, and therefore their strategy is to use a transport system. Blood is needed to deliver nutrients from the digestive system to the muscle cells. Okay, so your blood provides your muscles with the oxygen and with the glucose that it needs to provide the energy for you to be able to move, and they have a really, really good blood supply to provide them with those things. Okay. So we've hit our first two objectives. Coming into land with our third objective. This is one that's a little bit of revision really from stuff that we did earlier in year 8. And we're going to talk about how we use organelles, the structures within a cell, things like the nucleus, the cell walls, and mitochondria, those kind of organelles to identify members of different kingdoms of life. Okay, so a quick reminder of those 5 kingdoms of life. You can see here at the top, we've got animals, which is obviously the kingdom that we fall into. You've got the plant kingdom, the fungi kingdom, which you're going to spend a bit more time looking at in your next lesson with Miss Lewis. She's going to be talking you through a whole lesson talking about fungi and a few different aspects of this particular kingdom of life. And then we've got these 2 kingdoms here, which we are hopefully now familiar with, but were new for us when we did these at the start of the year. We've got prokaryotes, which is the name for organisms such as bacteria that don't have a nucleus. Their DNA is free floating in the cytoplasm. And then we have this interesting group here, which really this topic is all about, this group, which is called the Protoctista. They're also known as protists. And this is the kind of the group that's made up of single-celled organisms like amoebas, like paramecium. They'd come into this group. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is it that makes a plant a plant. What is it that makes a prokaryote a prokaryote? So let's have a look at those different characteristics. Okay, so to do this, what I'm going to ask you to do, if you've got access to this particular worksheet, you should hopefully have it assigned to you on Frog. It should be a handout that you can get access to and print. Likewise, direct from this PowerPoint, you may be able to simply print the slide if you need it, or if neither of those two options are available to you, you can just copy this across into your book if you'd like to. We're going to just go through and take each of these 5 kingdoms one at a time. And as I go through and just talk you through some of the key features of each, what I'd like you to do is to fill in the table about each one, simply stating firstly, is it multicellular or unicellular? I'd like to give you an example of each of the 5 types. So write down an example in the box as well. And then we're going to go through, and what I'd like to do is to kind of put a yes or no, a tick or a cross into the rest of the table, telling me whether or not these organisms have these different organelles. So we're looking for cytoplasm, cell membranes, cell walls, nucleus, mitochondria, or chloroplast. If there's any other extra bits that you can put in there, you might leave a bit of space so you can add any extra notes for some of them. But we're going to go through one at a time and just kind of really clarify and make it clear what the key differences are between these 3 different categories of life. Okay, so here's the first few boxes to get you started. So we're doing animals together here. You can see an example is humans, or you can put the jellyfish in there. Obviously, animals are multicellular, so we've got an M in there for multicellular. We've got a tick for nucleus because animal cells have a nucleus and they don't have chloroplasts. Okay, so we're going to go through and I'm going to just talk you through the rest of these 5 kingdoms, and what I'd like to do is to fill in the rest of the table as you go, and we'll go through and review it at the end, and you can check to see how well you've done. Okay, so animals, kind of the group we're most familiar with, the one that we come from. Animals come in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, but we are all multicellular, from the blue whale all the way down to the ant. They're all made of multiple cells, not just one cell. Animal cells have no chloroplasts. So as soon as if you're looking at a cell and it has a chloroplast, it may not be a plant, but you can definitely say it's not an animal. Animal cells do not have chloroplasts. They can't make their own food, so they don't use the sun's light to make their food. They instead have to find it and eat it. That's called heterotrophic. They have to eat their own food to be able to produce energy. Animal cells have no cell wall. They obviously have a cell membrane to allow substances to come in and out, but they don't have a cell wall. Some animals have skeletons for support, whilst others have exoskeletons. So animals like crabs and many insects will have an exoskeleton on the outside of them to give them that structure, whereas others are just finding squidgy, things like jellyfish doesn't need any kind of skeleton or support system. You can see there's a few different examples. So the human body cell, we know we've got about 17 to 30 billion new cells every day, just to replace those that die naturally. And this particular parasite contains just 2 or 3 cells. Scientists have only recently realized that they're not protoctists. So these very small, what we used to think were single-celled organisms, actually are made up of 2 or 3 different cells altogether. Here's the kind of the diagram that you're hopefully very, very familiar with now. We'll keep revisiting this every year. In most topics of biology, to be honest, this is our animal cell diagram. You can see the main organelles that we can see there. Cell surface membrane on the outside, which controls which substances come in and out. You've got your cytoplasm in the middle, which is where all the chemical reactions take place within the cell. The nucleus in the middle contains the DNA and kind of acts as the control center of the cell, deciding what functions it needs to carry out. And then lastly, we've got these mitochondria in the middle. And this is a slightly higher level organelle, but this is one that's responsible for respiration. This is where respiration takes place within the cell. Okay, so plants, moving on. Again, should be fairly familiar with plants with the work that we've done in year 8 so far. Quite looked at plants in quite a lot of detail, really. But along with animals, plants form the most complex group of multicellular organisms. They contain so many cells. Plants need transport systems to carry nutrients to cells that they can't absorb or make on their own. You don't think about plants having transport systems, but they do. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. Plants have no skeleton, but their cell walls give them a really rigid support so they can hold themselves up and support themselves. And they produce their own food through the process of photosynthesis. A few examples here. We've got the General Sherman, the world's largest giant sequoia tree, contains billions of cells. So these giant California redwoods and sequoias are some of the largest living things on planet Earth. These enormous trees. You can see the little human being at the bottom there, just to give you a scale of how large these trees are. This particular plant is the world's smallest plant, containing no more than a few hundred cells. But even these tiny, tiny plants are still multicellular. And here's our plant cell. Again, you should be pretty familiar with this. We've got the standard organelles that we saw in our animal cell, so things like a nucleus. We've got mitochondria, surface membrane. But for a plant, the cell surface membrane, if you remember, is on the inside of the two. We've got two lines here. The outside line is the cell wall, which gives it that rigid structure and shape that it needs. The inside line is the cell membrane, and then lastly the cytoplasm. We've then got a couple of extra organelles for plants. We've said the cell wall already. We've also got the chloroplasts around the outside, which are green because they're filled with this green pigment called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the pigment that enables them to absorb sunlight and carry out photosynthesis to produce their food. And in the middle, that food will then be stored within the vacuole, this large storage structure in the middle here that kind of stores sugars for use later on. Okay, so those are the kind of basic features of a plant cell. Our next group are the prokaryotes, and these are our single-celled organisms, and they are the smallest forms of life, but also some of the oldest forms of life as well, including all bacteria. And all organisms within this particular category are all made of one cell. They're all unicellular. These are very, very simple cells. They don't have a nucleus. So that word prokaryote means kind of before the nucleus. They're very, very old, and they don't have a nucleus that contains their DNA. Their DNA is free floating in the cytoplasm. Many prokaryotes cause problems, such as the bubonic plague, as we've just seen this particular example. Yersinia pestis caused the plague, and Vibrio cholerae causes cholera. However, many of them are harmless, and actually a lot of them are actually very good for us. We need to have bacteria in our gut, for example, to help us digest a range of different foods. So a few examples here. Some of these you might recognize. This one is most commonly known as salmonella. This obviously causes food poisoning. This example here is a real pain at the moment for the medical profession. MRSA. This is a type of bacteria which is resistant to antibiotics. And here's another Helicobacter pylori. This is another one that causes digestive problems and problems with your digestive system. So these different types of bacteria, some are harmful, some are harmless, and many are even good for us. A few features of their cells. You'll come to look at this in a lot more detail further up the school, but just a basic overview. Key thing with a prokaryote or a bacterial cell is that they don't have a nucleus. That's what you're looking for, really. You can see in the middle of their cell, they have their DNA free floating in the cytoplasm, either as something called a plasmid or as this just large loop of DNA. Many bacterial cells will have a cell wall, though, so there's something they have in common with a plant cell. Their cells have a cell wall around the outside. They also have a cell membrane on the inside layer, cytoplasm in the middle where the cell reactions take place, and many of them also have this kind of structure here. It's called a flagella, a bit like a tail to help them to move. Okay, so they're very simple organisms, very small, and you can see there they've got different features, a bit of a mix of animal and plant cell features there. Okay, and then the other group that's quite tricky for many people, the one that many people forget about, is this group here, the Protoctists, which is really the group that we're focusing on in this particular topic, this unicellular topic. Protoctists are sometimes confused with bacteria because most Protoctists are unicellular. They're usually made of just one cell. However, they can be a little bit larger, and some of them are up to 1 millimeter long. Protoctists have a nucleus to contain their DNA, so that's how you know if you're looking at a Protoctist or a prokaryote. If it has a nucleus, or you can see something that looks like a nucleus, it's probably going to be in this group here, in the Protoctist group. Most Protoctists do not have a cell wall either, so they can look a little bit like animal cells under the microscope. Most of them cause some horrible diseases, especially in poorly developed countries. You can see a few examples here. Plasmodium is an example of a Protoctist that causes malaria. A lot of people get malaria confusion. I think that malaria is caused by a virus or by a bacterium, but actually malaria is caused by a single-celled organism that lives inside of a mosquito for its life cycle and then gets passed on to human beings. This particular tryptophan is called tryptophan soma. It causes sleeping sickness, which can be fatal, and then you've got an amoeba here, which can cause pretty horrific diarrhea, which again can be pretty nasty disease in many parts of the world. Here's a few diagrams just to kind of familiarize yourself. Again, you can see it looks pretty animal cell-like, but it looks very much like an animal cell. You can see it's got a nucleus, it's got a cell membrane, cytoplasm, it's got a few other features, things like a vacuole as well. But looking at that, you might think, well, why is that not an animal cell? You might think, well, surely that's got to be in the group. Well, the reason it's not classified as an animal is because of the fact that it's single-celled. Remember what we said earlier, animal cells have to be multicellular. And so if you find a cell like this on its own, it must be protoctist. The other thing to say is that with these protoctists is that they often have some of these other organisms. This group often contains organisms that don't really fit into any others. So, for example, over here you've got Euglena. And Euglena is an animal, or sorry, an organism that has a flagellum, so it can move, but it also has things like a chloroplast and a nucleus, and it's got a bit of a mix of organelles from animal cells and plant cells and other organisms as well. And so we classify this as a protoctist because it's single-celled, because its DNA is found in the nucleus, and it has a lot of these different other organelles as well. Okay, so most protoctists, like the amoeba, are similar to animal cells. Pseudopods help the cell to move, although they're not shown in the diagram. Protoctists contain lots of mitochondria as well. And as we said, many of these cells also contain chloroplasts so that they can carry out photosynthesis. Okay, and then the last group, which is the group that Ms. Lewis is going to kind of go through with you in a bit more detail next lesson, is the fungi. We know a little bit about fungi already, hopefully, mushrooms and molds and those kind of things. They live in the soil and on the side of dead things. So you find them in the soil and on dead organisms. They're essential for breaking down decaying matter. So a lot of the decomposition that goes on is carried out by fungal organisms. Most fungi are multicellular, although, for example, things like yeast are single-celled, so it can be a bit both. Fungi have complex systems, which include a nucleus, and fungi also produce many of the world's antibiotics. Things like penicillin have been produced from fungi. So a few examples here, you've got the mold penicillin here, which we use to produce antibiotics, and you've got yeast, which is a single-celled fungus that we use in baking bread and brewing beer. And those kind of processes. Okay, a few quick diagrams of fungal cells, and again, Miss will go through these with you in a bit more detail, but the key features of a fungus are that they can be either multicellular or unicellular, but they generally have a cell wall, but their cell wall is made of something different. So plant cell walls are made of something called cellulose, and this is maybe something you might want to jot down in your table, that in the plants column where you've got the cell wall, you should have a tick, but you might want to just note that it's made of a special substance, it's a form of carbohydrate called cellulose. Some of you may have heard of that word before. So plant cell walls are made of cellulose, and that gives them that rigid shape and structure, whereas a fungal cell wall is made of something called chitin. That's spelled CHITIN, and that's just a distinguishing factor between fungi and plants. You can tell they both have a cell wall, but their cell walls will be made of different substances. Fungi also don't have chloroplasts because they don't photosynthesize. These things are heterotrophic. They don't make their own food. They, similarly to animals, they rely on other things to provide their food for them. And in the case of fungi, they rely on organisms that are dead to provide them their food. Okay, so here's our table. Hopefully you've gone through and just filled in a little bit of that as we've gone through and talked through it. Let's see if there's anything missing, if there's anything you didn't manage to fill in. Here we go, so we'll quickly whiz through this, a few examples of each. So you can see an example of a prokaryote. You could say E. coli or the one that caused the bubonic plague, Y. pestis. For protoctists, you've got an amoeba or an algae. For fungi, you could say penicillin or yeast. Plants, many you could say, but you've got here oak trees or ivy, and then again we've got the humans when we're done. Prokaryotes are unicellular. Protoctists can be both, so you can have both in there. But protoctists are primarily unicellular, so they've gone mainly uni, but you can see there's a few multicellular examples. Other way around for fungi, most fungi are multicellular, but there are a few examples that are unicellular. And then lastly, plants and animals are both multicellular. All 5 kingdoms of life have cytoplasm. All 5 kingdoms of life have cell membranes. Cell walls are found in prokaryotes, fungi, and plants. Remember, in fungi and plants, they're made of different substances. In plants, it's made of cellulose. In fungi, it's made of this substance called chitin. In protoctists, generally they don't have cell walls, but there are some examples that do. And in animals, cell walls aren't found at all. For the nucleus, the only one that doesn't have a nucleus is the prokaryote. They have their DNA free floating. All the other forms of life, all the other kingdoms have their DNA stored within the nucleus. Same for mitochondria. All four, apart from prokaryotes, so protoctists, fungi, plants, and animals all use mitochondria to carry out respiration. And then lastly, chloroplasts are only really found in plants, and there are a few examples in the Protoctista group which have chloroplasts as well. So prokaryotes, fungi, and animals, neither of those types of living thing contain chloroplasts. Okay, so have a look at yours, see how well you did. If there's any changes you need to make, please do that before we move on to our last task. Okay, so quick overview. These are three things we've covered in the lesson so far. We've talked about differences between unicellular and multicellular organisms. We've explained why multicellular organisms need to have an efficient transport system. We've talked about the fact that diffusion is just too slow when you've got a bigger organism. You need to have other ways of getting those substances around your body. And then lastly, we've looked at some of the different differences between these 5 kingdoms of life and how we use the organelles they contain to distinguish between them. Okay, we're going to finish with these questions. So I'm going to just leave these with you and then we'll go through them in a moment. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so just to go through and answer these in your book. If you're writing this book up, if you can write out the question or make sure that you're reflecting the question in your answer, that you're writing in full sentences, so that if you do send your work on to the teacher to check, they can go through and just kind of double check with you and check that you've got the answers correct. So I'll give you those for a few minutes and then we'll go through them. If you want to pause the video now. And then we'll check your answers in a moment. Okay, so let's have a quick look through these summary questions together. Hopefully that was helpful just to kind of check your understanding, to make sure you're happy with what we've covered in today's lesson. So if you've got a pen, you can just go through and kind of mark these yourselves just to check that you're happy with it. So question number 1 said, what does the word unicellular mean? You can see question 1, the answer there. A cell that contains or is made up of one cell only. Number 2 was name 3 unicellular organisms. So there's loads you could say, but a couple of examples that we've got there, you could say E. coli, or any form of bacteria, salmonella, any of those. You could say an amoeba, paramecium, yeast, euglena or algae, loads of others that you could give there. Any of those would be fine. Question 3 said, which 2 kingdoms are never unicellular? And the only 2 that you could say were plants and animals. Those 2 always are multicellular organisms. Question number 4 said, what is unusual about where prokaryotes or bacteria keep their DNA? And the answer there, as you can see, is they don't have a nucleus. The DNA is free floating in the cytoplasm. Question 5 says, name 4 features found in a fungal cell. Slightly tricky question, that one. You can see the answer you can get there. You could say nucleus, as most cells contain, apart from bacteria, obviously. Cytoplasm, cell membrane, cell wall, if you remember, is made of chitin as well, and a mitochondria. Those are the kind of 5 things that fungi will have inside of their cells. Question 6 was, what do fungal cells have that animal cells don't? And the answer we're looking for there is a cell wall. And then lastly, question 7, what do plant cells have that fungal cells don't? And again, the answer we're looking for is chloroplasts. And those structures that are filled with green chlorophyll to help them to photosynthesize. Okay, well, I hope you've done well with those questions. I hope you found that helpful. Me just talking you through the different aspects of this lesson. Like I say, this is a bit of an introductory lesson to this topic, really. And what you can do now is to go on to look at one particular group of single-celled organisms in particular, which is the fungal group, next lesson. And if there's anything in this lesson straight away that you've come across that you just think, I'm not quite happy with that, I'm not quite sure I understand the differences between fungi and Protoctista or anything in this lesson, please do kind of get in touch with either me or your science teacher, and we can do what we can to support you. Keep going, guys. You're doing really, really well. These are testing circumstances, but I'm hoping that these little resources we're sending out are beneficial to you. So keep going, and looking forward to seeing you soon. Cheers.